The medieval era is often remembered as a time of darkness, plague, war, and religious oppression. But buried beneath these grim images lies a lesser-known side of medieval society, one surprisingly filled with pleasure, sensuality, and indulgence. Contrary to popular belief, people in the Middle Ages were not entirely reserved or puritanical. In fact, their attitudes towards sexuality and leisure were much more open and tolerant than one might expect. This episode explores how medieval people pursued pleasure through sex, drink, games, festivals, and even bawdy humor. While the church attempted to enforce moral codes, everyday people often found ways to bend, avoid, or outright defy those rules. One major misunderstanding about medieval life stems from the sources available today. Most surviving records were created by religious institutions, especially the church, whose role was to preach restraint and discipline. Naturally, these sources reflect a moral ideal, not the actual behavior of the general population. So while church documents condemned lust and pleasure, archaeological evidence and secular writings reveal a society far more nuanced and diverse. In medieval England, cities like York were thriving centers of commerce and culture. As the second largest city after London, York was bustling with people, trade, and life. With such a high concentration of residents, private lives often spilled into public view. Inns, bathhouses, and marketplaces were not just places of business, but also centers of social interaction, flirtation, and often discreet liaisons. Medieval sexuality wasn't hidden behind closed doors as rigidly as modern assumptions might suggest. Public displays of affection, flirtation, and even explicit jokes were not uncommon. In fact, certain religious festivals and village fairs encouraged behavior that was far from modest. These events became moments when social norms were relaxed, and the ordinary people found room to express themselves freely. Despite efforts by the church to suppress carnal pleasure, human nature often triumphed. Medical texts of the time, surprisingly, recommended sexual activity as part of a healthy life. Sex wasn't seen solely as a sinful act, it was also considered therapeutic. Even some monks and clergy, who were sworn to celibacy, are known to have broken their vows, highlighting the difficulty of repressing natural desires. The medieval marketplace sold more than just grain and wool. It also offered remedies for love, fertility, and even aphrodisiacs. Herbal concoctions, charms, and potions were widely available. Many were marketed to women, emphasizing their role not just as caretakers, but as active participants in romantic and sensual life. The attitude towards female pleasure in particular was surprisingly progressive in some regions. Contrary to the stereotype of medieval women being entirely submissive or voiceless, many texts suggest women had expectations, desires, and even agency in matters of love and intimacy. Popular ballads and poems often portrayed strong, witty women who pursued their own romantic interests. Art and literature also reflected this openness. Illustrated manuscripts, carvings, and even church architecture sometimes featured risk imagery, suggesting that the line between sacred and profane wasn't always clear. Erotic humor appeared in plays and street performances, entertaining crowds across social classes. But pleasure in the Middle Ages wasn't limited to sexuality alone. Communal drinking, music, dancing, storytelling, and games played a huge role in everyday joy. Alehouses and taverns were hubs for gossip and camaraderie. Public spaces frequently hosted dancing and theatrical performances, making entertainment accessible to common folk. Even punishments for sexual offenses tell an interesting story. While some were harsh, others were surprisingly lenient. Public shaming, such as parading someone around town or making them wear symbolic costumes, was often used instead of imprisonment. These penalties served more as moral warnings than criminal punishment. suggesting a society still negotiating its relationship with personal freedom. In the countryside, peasants lived under fewer social restrictions than their urban counterparts, while the nobility was expected to uphold a strict moral code. Rural communities often operated under their own unspoken rules. Love affairs, secret marriages, and sexual exploration were not uncommon in village life. Interestingly, historical court records show that women sometimes filed complaints about unfaithful or neglectful husbands, showing they were not powerless in relationships. The myth that medieval women were completely dominated by men is not entirely accurate. Even spiritual beliefs surrounding sex were layered. While church doctrine promoted chastity, many medieval people believed in mystical or magical aspects of intimacy. Folklore connected fertility with lunar cycles, natural elements, and even spiritual energy, blending religious belief with ancient pagan traditions. Ultimately, the Middle Ages were far more complex than the popular narrative suggests. Pleasure, whether physical, emotional, or communal, played a fundamental role in medieval life. And though institutions like the church tried to regulate behavior, human desire often found creative ways to flourish. This overlooked history offers a new lens through which to view the so-called Dark Ages. It wasn't all misery and repression. There was laughter, love, rebellion, and a vibrant quest for joy. Even in the shadows of castles and cathedrals,